So today we'll be discussing anatomy and physiology of the nervous system. By way of introduction, the nervous system consists of two divisions: the central nervous system, which contains the brain and the spinal cord, then the peripheral nervous system, which is a network of nerves and neural tissues that branch out throughout the body, as we can see here. There's the brain and the spinal cord here. Then there's the network of nerves and neural tissues that are branching out throughout the body. And there are different types of neurons. Neurons are nerve cells. If we say a cell is the basic unit of any system, neurons are that basic unit of the nervous system. So they are nerve cells. And they have the structural and the functional units of the nervous system. They conduct impulses that will enable the body to interact with its internal within the body and external environment. And there are various types of neurons. The tissues that support the nervous system, they call it neuroglia. It's called neuroglia cells. And the motor neurons usually have one axon. This is a classical motor neuron with only one axon for several dendrites. These are the dendrites. These things that look like branches of a tree. These are the dendrites. And the axon is covered with an insulating fatty layer called the myelin sheath. These are the myelin sheaths. And this myelin sheath would help to transmit signals across a long distance from the neuron to the area to be activated. So assuming the axon terminals are ending on the area to be activated, it will transmit signals across this length of the axon through the myelin sheaths. And dendrites, they are unsheathed. You can see these don't have this type of myelin sheaths on them, and they are much shorter than the axon. So if you have the cell of a motor neuron and you're wondering what to make out of it, dendrites are much shorter. They are not sheeted. They don't have a myelin sheath like the axon. Even though they seem to have what looks like an axon terminal on their end, they are not axon terminal. They're just dendritic ends. And motor neurons will cause muscle contraction. They will control the secretion from glands and other organs. Essentially, they control body functions. Sensory neurons do not have true dendrites. This is a picture of a classical sensory neurons. They don't have the true dendrites compared to the one we just saw that time. They are attached to sensory receptors and they will transmit impulses to the central nervous system. And this will then stimulate the interneurons and then motor neurons. So this is the flow of impulse from the nerve receptors to the sensory neurons, to the interneurons, to the motor neurons. And interneurons are located entirely within the central nervous system, and they will intercept impulses. It's almost like an intermediary messenger, so to say. They will intercept impulses from the sensory neurons and will then transmit the signals to the motor neurons. Now, the nerve fibers, this is a picture of a nerve fiber, and if you want to view the layers in which they are sheathed, you have the Schwann cells, and it's only found on peripheral nerves, and which can regenerate. Then you have the myelin sheath. It's a fatty insulation on some nerve cells, not all. Then you have axon. This is what will ultimately transmit the message. But Schwann cells are found on peripheral nerves. So there are no Schwann cells on the nerve fibers in the central nervous system. It's found in peripheral nerves. Therefore, damages to the nerve fibers is not reversible. But the ones that would happen to peripheral nerves can be reversible because the Schwann cells will enable it to regenerate. The bundle of nerve fibers is called a nerve. And afferent nerves will conduct impulses to the central nervous system, while efferent nerves will conduct impulses to the muscles the organs, and the glands. Nerve impulses are transmitted via branches called synapses. Synapses, they're like connectors. They will hook dendrites and other axons from one neuron to the other. These synapses will be somewhere in between here because they are connectors and they are hooking dendrites and other axons from one neuron to the other. And the synapses of influence, the number of synapses will ultimately influence transmission because it's from one synaptic junction to another one. So especially when you have multiple synaptic ends, it will influence transmission. And that number can decrease from a disease if it's not being used. That's from lack of stimulation or drug use. Some substances have the ability to decrease that synaptic transmission or the number of synapses. The gray and white matter of the central nervous system. The brain and the spinal cord of the central nervous system will receive impulses then to process the information and it will respond with the appropriate action. Gray matter of the brain and the spinal cord consists of unsheathed, we said it earlier, the sheathed one is found in the peripheral nervous system, but that of the brain and spinal cord, which is the central, consists of unsheathed nerve fibers, meaning when they are damaged, they cannot be regenerated in the cortex or the surface layer. And the white matter makes up the internal structure, consists of myelinated nerve fibers. The brain and the spinal cord, the brain and the spinal cord are enclosed by membranes, collectively known as meninges. Collectively known as meninges. And the outer membrane is the dura. Here you have the dura here. And the middle membrane is the arachnoid. Here you have the arachnoid. And the inside membrane is the pia mater. The cerebrum takes up 7/8 of the brain's weight. Is the largest part of the brain, and it governs all the sensory and motor activity. And this will include the sensory perception, emotions, consciousness, ability to be conscious, memory, and voluntary movement, and is divided into both the right and the left hemisphere. There's the right and the left hemisphere, and the surface or the cortex is arranged in bulging furrows. Each one is called a gyra. That's the cosine. Okay, these are furrows. These are furrows. And these are gyras. Those things that look like gutters are called furrows. So the cortex is also divided into 4 lobes that correspond to the overlying bones of the skull. The frontal lobe specializes in motor activity, personality, and speech. This is the frontal lobe. This is the frontal lobe of the cerebrum, and it specializes in motor activity, personality of an individual, speech. We also control speech. So injury or damages to this frontal lobe can change an individual's personality, can alter their speech pattern or their ability to speak, can even affect their motor coordination, and some motor skills they had before, they can also lose it. So the parietal lobe is where language, ability to control temperature, pressure, touch, they are interpreted. Damage to this area would also affect those functions. And the temporal lobe will contain the centers for hearing, ability to hear, to smell. Language input is seated in the temporal lobe. And the occipital lobe is the special area for vision. Damage to this area would affect or impact an individual's vision. The cerebellum, this is the cerebellum. It's quite small. It's the second largest part of the brain, but it's still quite small in comparison to the cerebrum. And it contains nerve fibers that connect it to every part of the central nervous system, and it coordinates voluntary and involuntary patterns of movement. It also adjusts muscles to automatically maintain posture. So in diseases of the cerebellum, one of the problems they will have is posture. It's difficult for them to control posture or to coordinate posture and coordinate movements. Then the diencephalon refers to the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The thalamus is the relay center for all sensory impulses except that of smell, the olfactory and motor areas of the cortex. So hypothalamus regulates behavior, emotional expression, body temperature, and some other metabolic activities, and is attached to the pituitary gland. So it also controls hormonal secretions of this gland, the pituitary gland in this case. And the brainstem will consist of three structures: the gray matter of the midbrain, which will control visual reflexes and sense of hearing; the white matter of the pons, which plays a role in regulating the internal organs function; then the medulla oblongata would connect the rest of the brain to the spinal cord. And it regulates breathing, swallowing, sneezing, vomiting, heartbeat, and blood pressure. So now this is some remnants of the spinal cord. Of course, the rest will extend deep into the spine. And this is the medulla oblongata, parts of it. This is part of the pons. This is part of the midbrain. This is the diencephalon. This is the cerebellum we talked about, the one that controls motor coordination. And this is the largest part of the brain, which is the cerebral hemisphere. The spinal cord has 31 segments. There are 8 cervical segments. And it corresponds to C1 to C8, from somewhere here to C8. And there are 12 thoracic segments, that's from T1 to T12. And there are 5 lumbar segments, which is from L1 to L5. And of course, there is S1 to S5, and there is a coccyx, the coccygeal remnant. So the 44 cm long spinal cord is shorter than the spinal column. So the spinal cord is much shorter than the spinal column in some respect. So segments do not perfectly correspond to the vertebra. So when you want to check the spinal cord versus the vertebra, it may not correspond 100% because of that discrepancy in the length. So viewing a spinal cord, at each segment of the spinal cord, the left and right pairs of sensory and motor nerves will branch out and connect to the peripheral nervous system. So impulses will travel back and forth to the brain and back to the muscles through these segments of the spinal cord. And within the spinal cord is something called the cerebrospinal fluid, and it's colorless and it's produced in the ventricles of the brain. And the function is to surround the brain and the spinal cord, and it will cushion the brain and the cord from shocks that could cause injury. So it's maintained at a level of around half to 2/3 of a cup. That's the volume. A measuring cup in this case, that's what I mean by a cup. So the peripheral nervous system is a network of nerves that branches out throughout the body from the brain and the spinal cord, and it's called the peripheral nervous system. So in addition to the 31 pairs of spinal nerves mentioned on the slide we looked at earlier, there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves that are attached to the brain. The first is the olfactory nerve. So cranial nerve 1 is the olfactory nerve, and what it does is to carry sensory input for smell. The second is the optic nerve for vision. The third is oculomotor nerve that will control the movement of the eye and the eyelids. The fourth is the trochlear nerve, will control the eyeball. The fifth is the trigeminal nerve, and it will control the face, the nose, the mouth, forehead, and top of the head and the jaw. Then the abducens will control the eyeball. The facial nerve will control the movement of the face, the scalp, and part of the tongue, and it will also help for taste. Then the auditory or cochlear nerve will provide sensory inputs for hearing and for equilibrium. So when there's damage to the auditory nerve, ability to hear may be impaired and the person may lose their balance. Then the glossopharyngeal nerve will control saliva, swallowing, and taste. The vagus nerve is the longest cranial nerve and it extends to and controls the arts. So all the way from the cranium, it extends to the arts and it controls the arts, the lungs, the stomach, and the intestine. The accessory nerve permits movement of the head and the shoulders, and the epiglossal nerve will control the muscles of the tongue. So the autonomic nervous system is also part of the peripheral nervous system, and it controls the involuntary bodily functions such as sweating. That's not voluntary. You don't choose that you want to sweat or not. Secretion of the glands, that is not within your control. Then blood pressure and the heart, and it's divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. Essentially, the autonomic nervous system controls all this. The eye secretion of the lacrimal gland, secretion of mucous membrane, salivary gland, sublingual gland, mucous membrane of the mouth. We would also control the parotid gland, controls the heart in some respite, controls the lungs, controls the movement of the stomach, and so on and so forth. So the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for fight or flight responses. So something happens, you are in danger, your body would mobilize all that you need to get out for a fight or get out for a flight. And these fight and flight responses will include alertness, increase in metabolic rate, increase in respiratory rate, blood pressure will shoot up, heart rate will go up, it could be sweating, and it will then lead to a decrease in digestive and urinary function. When you have something that is quite frightening happening, you're not planning to go to the toilet to pee, then so urinary function goes down. That would then will not be a time that you say you want to go and use the toilet. Digestive function will go down. That will not be a time you say you are hungry when you are experiencing a fight or flight situation. So these functions will go down, and the parasympathetic nervous system will counteract the response of the sympathetic system, restoring homeostasis. So when fight and flight is gone, there's nothing stressing the individual again. The parasympathetic system will then take over, then restore the body to homeostasis. So when you have a sympathetic, I'll still give you the slide though, but when you have a sympathetic response, fight or flight, the pupils will dilate, then salivary secretion will reduce, heart rate is increased, the bronchi will dilate, if there's inhibition of peristalsis, that's movement of the guts, and secretion within there, glycogen will be converted to glucose, bladder contraction will be inhibited just so that you're able to mobilize all that you need to be able to address that fight or flight situation. And of course, when the individual then comes to parasympathetic state of rest, relaxation, pupils will constrict, there's increased salivary flow, which is why when patients have surgery, they have a lot of secretions and you may need to be suctioning every now and then, especially for those who are intubated, those who have a general anesthesia that the parasympathetic influence is high. Then the heart rate is slower, bronchi will constrict, and so many other things. Okay, so thank you. I think that ends this slide.